Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy, and he's also the vice chair of the Committee on the Present Danger China, presentdangerchina.org, as he mentioned. An open letter out to the president saying that we should not fund our enemies. There's actual legislation that would stop this. Joni Ernst talked about it with us on the radio last week. Frank, it's a good move. Who do you got signing the letter with you, and what do we need to do to give it some attention?
Well, thank you for doing it today, Alex, for starters. This is a letter that was signed by two former national security advisors to the president. One Republican, Ronald Reagan's John Poindexter, the other a Democrat, Barack Obama's General Jim Jones. We had, in addition, a large number of other military personnel who have a very particular concern about funding companies in China that are building weapon systems with which to kill their comrades in arms, and well, I think others of us for that matter. There were some former legislators. There were a number of people who are business leaders, who are faith leaders, who are human rights activists, some just plain old-fashioned patriotic American and concerned citizens. But taken all together, I think what it represented was a very powerful expression of concern that people who seem indifferent, even before the pandemic, impressed upon all of us the craziness of this, but they certainly should be on notice now that we do not want to reward communist China by further enriching companies, including companies that oppress the Chinese people, including companies that are sanctioned by our government for proliferation activities, for example, or for human rights violations. We don't want to be enriching those companies at a moment when it would unmistakably be perceived by the communist Chinese as a reward for what they've just perpetrated on us. And as you heard, I believe Senator Cotton is absolutely right. Congressman Scott Perry wrote about it in the Washington Times as well. These are serious legislators who are connecting dots and realizing that the Chinese knew full well what they were dealing with before we did. And they chose to spread around the world this pandemic disease when we were unprepared for it and were obliviously following the World Health Organization guidelines, which were being dictated by Beijing, which was, well, basically, there's nothing to see here, folks. Move along. So people can get involved in this by going to presentdangerchina.org. There's a petition there. There's a widget that you can use to send a message to the White House or send it to your elected representatives in Congress. And after all of those people, everybody who works in the White House, everybody who works in the Pentagon, everybody who works throughout the executive branch, everybody who works in the United States Congress, they're all going to have their money put into these sorts of malevolent Chinese companies. They should be all about stopping this. Legislation is good, Alex, but what we need right now, because this money is about to move to China at the hands of an unaccountable board, is for the president to intervene, and we hope he will.
So I've got two important follow-ups. So after 50-plus press briefings, Breitbart finally got a question in, Frank. I don't know if you caught this on Monday.
Congratulations. And then they stopped having them.
I mean, it's the...
Do you think there's cause and effect there, Alex?
It's a very bittersweet congratulations there, Frank. After you would think it'd be unthinkable that would be the way that the White House would operate, yet it is precisely how they operate. And we asked about holding China accountable, and that was, he got an unsatisfying answer, but it does at least seem like it's on the president's radar. And I liken it to one of my favorite analogies, which is when you flip a coin, you are the coin is always going to be heads or tails. It's never going to land in its side and not fall over in any direction. And I say that to mean that things are rarely stagnant in life. Things are generally either atrophying or they're improving, or they're going backwards or they're going forward. Very rarely are you just standing in one place. So we, of course, got called out by people who we don't care about, but I just noticed looking at social media, people were frustrated that Breitbart was focused on holding China accountable at this moment when we should be focused on whatever the establishment media is telling us to care about at that moment. And from my vantage point, Frank, to connect these things is that if we're not thinking about holding China accountable, China is going to benefit from this. They're going to benefit from their own pandemic. And this is a thing that there's, even amongst Republicans, feels like there's only a handful of people in Washington are understanding that the choice is let China win or you start holding them accountable now.
Yes. You know, Alex, there was a fascinating event that took place, and there will be some who assign this to the realm of conspiracy theories, but it's a fact. And the difference between conspiracies and conspiracy theories is fact. In October of last year, a gaggle of globalists led by Michael Bloomberg's Johns Hopkins University and the Bill Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the World Health Organization, the CIA, the Centers for Disease Control of this country, and, interestingly enough, the Centers for Disease Control of Communist China, got together for a tabletop exercise in New York City. It's all videotaped. You can go on Google and evaluate it for yourself. These folks were trying to figure out how a coronavirus pandemic could be used to advance their agenda of world governance by, among other things, strengthening the World Health Organization, finding new funding sources for the global governance agenda, and so on. And you're exactly right, Alex. Whether the Communist Chinese are interested in the same globalist agenda that the globalists are interested in or not, they have a common interest in taking us down. And I believe that it's predictable, and they certainly documented it in this tabletop exercise. It's predictable that a coronavirus pandemic would have a devastating effect on this country and others around the world. And China, I think, calculated that if they were going to have a pandemic, everybody else was, and they would probably benefit. We mustn't let that happen, certainly not with the retirement savings of military personnel and government employees, for heaven's sakes.
So I want to talk about the second point you made, because Tom Cotton was talking about this on, I think it was Fox on Sunday, and it really caught my attention. And he's been appearing on the show regularly. I just had him on, and he hadn't mentioned this. So I don't know if I'm going to get to talk to him about it for another week or two. But he had pointed out that he believed that China was aware of the pandemic, or it wasn't a pandemic yet. He was aware that the virus was out of control and was spreading and was probably going to jump borders. And instead of alerting the world, shutting their borders down, and falling on the sword, that they let it rage, probably with some calculation that you're making, Frank, which is that at a minimum, it will diffuse the economic catastrophe that was likely to ensue, to making it a global thing versus making a China-only thing, where China will suffer and the supply chains will still get interrupted, but it'll get interrupted where only really China suffers and the rest of us will, we'll take a haircut here or there, but we'll mostly be okay. But if it does jump overseas and spread around the world, then everyone suffers equally, maybe thanks to China's influence with Belt and Road and co-opting some of these globalist bodies and Health Silk Road and Huawei and 5G and all these things, all these tricks China has done to make people dependent on them. Maybe they would get away with it. Maybe they could even benefit from it, conceivably. And it's all something that these are all kind of abstract ideas that we're just starting to see connective tissue to them. But a lot of that makes sense to me.
Well, it does, and it makes sense to Senator Cotton. And I just want to thank you for giving him a regular platform, and thank you to him for being such a stand-up guy on this. A lot of what he has been saying has been vilified, has been treated by the mainstream press and others as ridiculous and tinfoil hat stuff. And yet, time and time and time again, what he has been saying, what he's been warning about, what he's been connecting dots concerning, has been vindicated. And I think this is another of those examples of what's going to be vindicated. We're finding out they did know about the disease. They didn't want it to be confined to their own borders because they thought if it were worldwide, they might be able to benefit, and they are in the process of trying to do that. And to your point, Alex, one of the things that, it's sort of a shorthand way of describing this, but their proposition to the world through their puppets at the World Health Organization, among other things, their propaganda instruments, their people who are, well, this fascinating. I don't know if you caught this the other day. Brian Dean Wright was on Tucker Carlson's program, I think 2 weeks ago, a guy self-described as a former CIA officer and Democrat, saying that when asked by Tucker, what's going on in the Democratic Party, and it's obviously not all of its members, but the leadership, he said, and the party as a whole, sort of falls into three categories. You've got useful idiots, you've got people who probably have some kind of relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, and then you've got some people, he said, on air, are probably agents of the Chinese intelligence service. Now, maybe that's an extreme view, but it's his. But the point is, the Chinese are very ably trying to, jujitsu this whole catastrophe. And what they've unleashed on all the world into advantage for them, make no mistake about it, they'd have us believe that communism is a cure for COVID-19. And if only you adopt some of the things that you talked about, Alex, their healthcare security system, for example, the social score, if you will, that they are now introducing not only in their own country but worldwide, 5G, the kind of reliance on the World Health Organization that they largely dominate. These sorts of things are insidious. And to the extent that we are seeing some of them now being sort of introduced and adopted in our own country. Just as an example, this takedown by YouTube of the video of these doctors, because why? It violated the community standards of YouTube because it was at odds with the World Health Organization recommendations. That's what the CEO of YouTube said. That's insidious. And the cumulative effect on our economy and our political system and our, freedom of speech, these are real threats to us, and they're to the delight of the Chinese Communist Party. Make no mistake about it.
Yeah, and Frank's point about YouTube is very frightening. And these doctors, this has been a video that had been sent to me a million times. I can't vouch for the veracity of the video, but what I can tell you this, Frank, is that we now are living in a moment where I actually have an editor-in-chief of Breitbart that's even above me, and that's Mark Zuckerberg, which is that if I post something on Facebook that I think is good and he doesn't, he can remove it. And, in fact, he can punish me and threaten to kick me off the platform. Now we have it where doctors, having a medical degree is secondary to being able to have control over YouTube and what's allowed on the platform. So the Google, YouTube, Alphabet people actually supersedes being a medical doctor. Mm-hmm. So medical doctors who are trained and certified and tested in practice professionally, those people are now secondary to the opinion of the people in Silicon Valley who want to police the content that all of us consume. Right. It is a stunning thing. I remember Dr. Tedros is not a medical doctor.
Correct.
He's a lab doctor.
He's a Marxist.
I don't know what he does. Well, he's also a hardcore leftist. He's someone where even the establishment press describes him as a far leftist. Obviously, he's got blood on his hands in this case in particular, but he's not even a doctor. He's not even, and I keep asking this question, how on earth did the top doctor on earth there isn't one doctor who is qualified to be the top doctor on earth? It's amazing that this happened, and we all allowed for it to happen, Frank, because so many of us are either on the take or asleep at the switch, and it has to end. It has to end right now, and if people don't start talking about it, and it goes to the administration, and I give the president lots of credit for raising awareness about China in the past, but it's not enough just to be polite at the moment. We cannot be polite about this issue.
No, you're so right. And look, you asked rhetorically, how did this happen? It happened because China was paying attention. China is paying attention very earnestly in how they can actually put their own nationals in charge of most of these organizations, or at least get one of their running dogs like Tedros to do so, and to follow slavishly their dictates. I mean, the fact that he doesn't have a medical degree is actually a plus. The fact that he is a Marxist is actually a plus from the Chinese Communist agenda. But again, it goes back to this point. We have largely, I believe, been very adversely impacted by what the WHO has been doing under this regimen, and to think that they're now able to enhance what you've been just saying about Zuckerberg and the YouTube counterpart and the others, to be able to dictate what we know, what we're allowed to say about certain things is chilling. And it must stop. I mean, I think the president's exactly right to investigate WHO and to cut off their funding pending that investigation. But these are the kinds of things that are further cause for very fundamentally rebooting our relationship with that organization and its management, for that matter.
Frank Gaffney, again, Center for Security Policy, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com. You heard a Secure Freedom Minute at the top of the segment. Also, Vice Chair on the Committee on the Present Danger, China, talking about some of the biggest issues we could possibly talk about, which is who's behind the pandemic, the why and the what, and where we go from here, in alarmingly little time dedicated towards the real problem here, which is it's not Donald Trump, it is China. China, as the president would say, and the World Health Organization. So it's interesting to kind of see some of the Congress will have to come back, Frank. And when they come back, they're going to have to consider whether or not we should keep funneling some of this money, literally their own pensions in some cases, to China. Are you optimistic that this is? I know we have to strike while iron's hot, but are you optimistic about some of the stuff you're putting on the table?
I was given a call by a very senior official in the Trump administration the other day, and he said, you've gotten the president's attention on this issue of the thrift savings plan. And we talked a bit about some things that could be done to prevent the migration of the funds of these retirees. And by the way, some of these are people who are active duty personnel in the military, not just veterans. So some of these are people who are serving, as I say, excuse me, Alex, in the government of the United States at this moment, not just previous administrations. These people's funds are at a knife's point right now because this, totally unknown board made up basically of finance industry insiders that is in charge of the thrift savings plan of the federal government and how its funds are deployed, is determined to get those funds into China. The so-called international fund, the I Fund, is going to mirror an MSCI index that has 11% of the funds in Chinese companies, including, as we talked about and as is laid out in this letter, the companies that manufacture weapons for China, the companies that produce this surveillance state apparatus system that is enslaving Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps and many other Chinese besides, that include companies that it's illegal to do business with, Alex, because they're sanctioned by the government, but you can still invest in them. And I just would ask you and your listeners this question. Just think about this for a moment. If these guys succeed long before Congress comes back, let alone before it does anything legislatively, if they succeed in getting funds of these kinds of government employees, military and civilian, into Chinese companies, don't you think that those individuals, and this isn't to question their loyalty, it's a practical reality, they're going to have a conflict of interest in taking a hard line on China because China will dictate their future financial security. That ought to, no other reason, that ought to be a showstopper here. And yet it's not even in play. But Donald Trump, I think, is now focusing on this, Alex, and I'm prayerful that he will take action using, I believe, the inherent authority he has under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA it's called, to prevent this from happening, at least, until there's a proper interagency review of the implications for our national security, as well as the economic interests of these beneficiaries, something that is not being considered at all by the so-called Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, which ought to be repopulated as far as I'm concerned. But before that happens, this has to be fixed, and I think only the president can do it.
I think that You're correct on this, and I think that there's one thing that I want to keep emphasizing, and that is that this is not, you don't need to go to conspiracy land. You don't need to even go to your darkest possibilities of what's possible here. All you need to do is think about the concept that was put forward by Michael Pillsbury in his book, The 100-Year Marathon, one of the books I recommend first if people want to understand my worldview on things. And he goes through that China's whole strategy was to get the entire world dependent on them and subservient to them economically, and that's how they would dominate the world. And then you see the way we're behaving. Look at the way the NBA behaves around China. Look at the way Hollywood behaves around China.
Right.
Look at the way even Republican portions of our government behave around China. And there's going out of your way to be apologists for China. And this is all fits a pattern, and the pattern is follow the money. The simplest thing that drives all of us to some degree, Frank, myself included, just not nearly to the extent that a lot of these corrupt individuals who are willing to sell out the American people to China. It's all about that. That's all what, and China figured this out, and they deserve credit for it. They figured it out. If we could just tie people into us economically, we will be their masters, and that's basically what's happening. And every time, this is why all of this makes sense, and the dots just, the dominoes just fall from there.
You got it. And Alex, you know, this was one of their takeaways from what we did to the Soviet Union, because it wasn't as deeply inside our wire. They found out that we could cut off their life support in terms of the cash flow and other things that were coming from the West to prop up their system. Deng Xiaoping said the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union is over back in 1991. He said there's a new Cold War between the United States and China will win it. And the way they did it through his so-called hide and bide strategy was exactly what you said, to penetrate us deeply, to get their hooks in us economically through predatory trade practices, through currency manipulation, through slave labor, through, well, essentially paying off, follow the money, paying off capitalists on Wall Street, most especially. $3 trillion by some estimates have migrated from our capital markets to China. They want another 3 to 5 trillion. A place to stop them, a place to start a new trajectory, excuse me, with Wall Street, Alex, is to stop this perhaps $50 billion fund migration from the thrift savings plans I fund into Chinese companies, probably not all of it, but a chunk of it. That must not happen. Don't reward China, and send a message to Wall Street that they need to invest patriotically now in America, not in our enemy.
Absolutely, and I think that the governments should come up with incentives to make it easier on them. I'm all for that, and this has got to be, I mean, I honestly think could potentially be the defining issue for the next 5 years in American life if President Trump wins. That this could be it. This could be what it's all for all the marbles.
Absolutely.
Frank, I don't have a ton more time, but I want to get your thoughts on Matt Boyle's epic exclusive from a couple of days ago that federal health officials are investigating the Wuhan lab suspected of leaking coronavirus and taxpayer grants to the lab. I have to tell you, this is a rare one where, you know, I had a lot of people, you know, even senators reaching out personally going like, what is going on here? This is a pretty wild one, and I want your thoughts on it.
Well, I woke up this morning to not your program, but to NPR broadcasting that's all a conspiracy theory, Alex. They've talked with people who have actually worked in those Wuhan Virology Institute labs, and this couldn't possibly have leaked out of there. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. I believe they're dead wrong. You're right. This needs to be investigated. We need to get to the bottom of it, and I don't think the answer is there's nothing to see here, folks.
And I got to tell you, I don't, and Frank, I challenged you on this a little bit last week, that I'm not someone in the camp where it is infinitely worse. I think if it came from the fact that they were eating pangolin and bats in undercooked bat soup, to me is almost more offensive than that they have some sort of a biological virus program, because that to me makes perfect sense. To me, the eating the pangolin and the bats and these inhumane wet markets.
There's no accounting for taste, Alex, as they say.
It may be, Frank. I don't know. I think there's a little accounting for taste, and it's still, as this report's out there, they're investigating it, So don't announce a conspiracy theory because China says it is.
Right.
And
That's
the
Chinese
only thing we have
propaganda,
right.
pure and simple.
It's Chinese propaganda. Have we learned our lesson? We've absolutely not learned our lesson. And this is what's going to drive me crazy. And this is why we have you on, Frank, and why we talk about these things.
Love
Frank
to do it.
Gaffney, keep up the great work. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you, my friend.